Hello everybody and welcome back to the Learning Academy. In the previous video what we did was spend some time talking about the extract questions for AQA A-level history. We talked about essentially a guide to being able to answer those extract questions. This video, as promised, is the exact same kind of guide, but instead for the source questions, the paper 2 compulsory question, and this is the second of three, which will then conclude with the essay questions, which are arguably the easiest to get your head around. This lesson is going to talk about the source questions. We're going to analyze the purpose of the source question. We're going to talk about how to answer the source questions, the tips for getting those top marks. I'm only concerned with getting a level 5 answer, a 21 to 25 marks, which is the sort of A and A star level. As well as top tips for how to really get those best marks when we are talking about the exam in, this exam will be at the start of June, in fact. So I believe it'll be at the start of June. I'll have to look at the timetable, but it is towards the end of May, start of June, the paper 2 exam. So we know already that AQA A-level history requires you to do 2 papers, in addition to some coursework, which is sort of subsidiary to what we're talking about here. You have a paper 1, you have a paper 2. Paper 1 is your breadth paper. It is essentially allowing you and inviting you to analyze quite a large period of history, and is essentially asking you to talk about the ways in which change and continuity takes place over that long period of history. The paper 2, the depth paper, is far more concerned with a particular period of history, a very small period of history compared to paper 1. It is often 20 to 30 years in terms of historical development. It often concerns periods of history which are quite tumultuous, are often concerning things like wars or revolutions and things like that, and really require you to have a good understanding and analysis of the detail of what takes place at various different stages throughout this history. Within paper 2, contained in this depth paper, is a source question. This is compulsory, and unlike extracts, source questions invite students to examine primary material to determine their validity, truthworthiness, their value, etc., etc. So it will be a primary source or a source written in the contemporary period, contemporary to the period, that you have to evaluate. You have to evaluate the material with reference to historical context. Now, whenever you see the phrase historical context or reference to historical context, what that simply means is the reference to your knowledge, reference to the history that you know, the actual things that takes place, the things that you have revised over the many months that you have been revising for your A-levels. This is one of the most important skills for a historian to have, a source question, the ability to understand sources. Historians at all levels, regardless of whether you're doing a GCSE, whether you're doing a degree or PhD, or whether you're writing a history book, should be able to read a piece of source material that was either written at the time or said at the time, and see what it says and analyze its value to the historian. How valuable is it to me as a historian? The purpose of a historian is to uncover what happened, to uncover the truth, to uncover what happened in the past, why it happened in the past, to what extent did this thing influence this other thing that happened in the past, who is to blame for what happened in the past, what are the sort of motivations, the understandings, the knowledge that the people at the time had about things in the past, all of which require you to understand and essentially put your mind into the mind of the people who are writing these sources at the time. If it's a speech by Vladimir Lenin, as cited in this image above, you have to put yourself into the mind of Vladimir Lenin and think what Vladimir Lenin was thinking, what he was saying, what he meant, to what extent did this thing, this source, this speech, let's say, that he had written, what value does that have to an historian who is studying this particular period of history? If I'm studying this period of history and I'm given this source, I'm given this speech by Vladimir Lenin, how much value can I get out of it? Is it worthless? Is it just propaganda? Or is it something that is actually really valuable? It tells us and gives us a lot of insight into whatever historical events that we are invited to analyze. This is why these exam questions invite students to essentially analyze their value for a historian studying a particular piece of history. So, fundamentally, you can sort of think of the source questions as having two parts, as there being sort of two things that you should really be able to pick apart in each of these sources. The first is the content and argument, okay? We'll get to this in a second, but this is just the first thing that you have to think about. The second is the provenance and tone. Sometimes these are even divided up between three, so sometimes you might have provenance being one and tone and emphasis being another. Some mark schemes do that, other mark schemes just combine this into provenance and tone. Fundamentally, what we're talking about, therefore, is firstly the content and the argument. Okay, this refers to the things that are actually said in the source. What does the source say about what is going on at the time? Is this valuable to a historian? Can a historian essentially get a better understanding of the events, the causes of an event, the reasons for something happening by using this source? If I'm trying to determine, and I'm a historian that's trying to ascertain, let's say, the causes of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917, and I'm given a source, a speech by Vladimir Lenin, can I, as a historian, look at the content of that source, look at what is being said, look at what is being argued in that source, and come to some good conclusions about how valuable it is? If I then take these arguments that are being made by Vladimir Lenin, and I compare it to the historical context, I compare it to what I actually know happened using all the specific knowledge that I have, how valuable is it? Does he just talk rubbish? Does he actually just spout propaganda? Does he actually say things that are valuable and give us insight into the history itself? All of which are very important things to actually ascertain as a historian. This part essentially involves a heavy examination of the content of the source in relation to the historical context. And in fact, the content and the argument part of the source question is actually quite similar to the way in which you answer extract questions in paper 1. Because if you remember back to when we did our guide to paper 1 to the extract questions, what you do there is you have an extract, which is often a paragraph or something taken from a historical book or a journal article, and you are basically invited to highlight what arguments the historian is making and analyze whether or not those arguments actually hold up to scrutiny, whether or not they actually are good for the historical context. Are they convincing? It's kind of similar in the sense that what you're doing here is you're taking arguments and you're trying to essentially match them against what you know to exist in the history, but except rather than doing this for a historian, you are doing this for a piece of contemporary source material. So, like I said here, a speech by Vladimir Lenin. The second part then is the provenance, tone, and emphasis of the source. So this is not just the content of the source that is valuable or not valuable to a historian. Not only do we have to think about the content of what is actually being said in the source, but you also have to refer to all of the things that surround the source. This is what I define these things as the surrounding elements of the source, the provenance, tone, and emphasis. Provenance refers to the sort of nature of the source, okay? Who wrote the source? What kind of source is it? What does this say about the intentions of the source? What do these elements say about the value of the source? Does the fact that it was written by one person mean that it has more value to an historian than if it was written by somebody else? If it was a speech that was delivered to 1,000 people, is this more or less valuable to a historian than if it was a confidential document that it was only delivered to a single person, or if it was a letter, or if it was a news broadcast or something? Does the type of source and who wrote the source say something about the intentions of the source? If it was a speech, is it a source to persuade, to inform a broader audience? If it was a confidential letter, does it give an opinion that is a private opinion rather than something that is positive and popular and public? All of these things are questions that you can ask about every single source that you are given. Tone and emphasis refers to the kind of language which is being employed in the source, because not all history and not all historical sources are written in the same way. Some can be very, very bland and very, very dry and very, very descriptive. And this will often be in reference to the nature of the source. So, like I said, a confidential report that is given to a government minister or something, that's going to be far drier and far more descriptive than a speech which is written and delivered to 1,000 people. That's going to be more flamboyant and that's going to be more provocative, okay? So let's use these examples then. So if the source in question, okay, is a speech that is made during an election campaign, let's say we're studying American history or the making of modern Britain or something like that, and we're doing a speech that is made by Thatcher or a speech that is made by Kennedy about a particular thing. What does the fact that it is a speech made by a politician in an election campaign, what does that say about the value of that source? Well, firstly, it is addressed at a wider audience rather than being something confidential. What does that say about its value? Is it more or less valuable because it's directed towards a wider audience? Its aim is probably more so to persuade an audience to vote for a particular candidate. If it's during an election campaign, this makes sense. What does that say about the value of the things that are said? For example, if it was a speech made by Margaret Thatcher in an election campaign, there's probably going to be greater emphasis on the parts of history which paints that particular candidate in a better light than other parts of history. So you might say that it has less value to a historian because it's going to be slightly emphasized towards the candidate. It's going to be essentially trying to paint the candidate in a better light than if it was something a little bit more objective. It's going to be subjective in a way, okay? And so therefore it might touch on some parts but not touch on other parts. And you can essentially use your knowledge of historical context to make a determination about what that actually does and what that actually means. The language used, like I said, is going to be more flamboyant. It's going to be more provocative. It's an election campaign. People who do election speeches are going to be very good orators. They're going to be very good at saying and speeches and making broad brush claims rather than being a lot drier and a lot more objective in terms of their understanding of historical context. Second example, a confidential military report about troop movements in a particular war, let's say World War II, and this was a confidential military report about the enemy's troop movements, where they're moving about, okay? This is going to be made for a much smaller audience because it's a confidential military report. It's going to only be directed towards people who need to know about this particular part of the conflict. It will be for military purposes, and this can have value owing to the fact that it is attempting to be as accurate as possible. It does not make sense to suggest that a confidential report about troop movements of the enemy troop movements should be biased, or it should emphasize one thing over another. It should be as accurate as possible because, of course, it's supposed to benefit the side that is being written about. And fundamentally, it will only provide information that is known to the author at the time that it is written. Don't forget, we are historians. We can actually have the benefit of hindsight in the sense that what is written in 1945, okay, the information that they might have then might be very different to the information that we have now. So we might have the benefit of hindsight to be able to ascertain some value or less value in that particular source. Now, as a sort of spoiler alert for those who want to go on to study history at university or something, things like a confidential military report or internal documents or documents to politicians like that explain things and events that are going on, these are seen as sort of the gold standard for historians because they represent the facts as accurately as possible as they are seen and perceived by the people that are writing the reports, because it doesn't make sense for them to be biased or to necessarily skew one way or another, or to try and be quite flamboyant and quite provocative in the language, because the purpose of that source is to inform a military general or to inform a politician or something like that. It isn't to persuade, let's say, people to vote for you in an election, okay? Now, that's not to suggest that they're all 100% accurate, but they are seen to be more of a gold standard than that of other primary sources. Some primary sources are more valuable than others. That is the whole point of this question. These questions are attempting to allow you to ascertain the value of sources for historians. Let's take an example then. The example that we're going to use is from the option 2R, which is the Cold War option, which I believe is 1945 to 1991, I believe is the time period that is studied. And the question comes from, it's an AS question, so it's a paper, a level, a year 12 question fundamentally, an advanced subsidiary question, but the same kind of standards apply. The only difference is, whereas the AS questions, you have 2 sources, the A2 questions you have 3 sources. They're very similar in terms of their mark schemes and stuff. So it is taken from the June 2022 mark scheme, the June 2022 exam season, and the question is, with reference to these sources and your understanding of historical context, which of these 2 sources is more valuable in explaining the failure of the Paris summit? Now, unfortunately, because AQA has a very strange tendency to actually block past paper source questions because of copyright reasons, which, in my opinion, allows them to have no value to students who are actually doing past papers in the first place, we only have access to one of these sources. So we're only going to analyze one of these sources, but you can get an understanding and a sort of flavor for how it actually works through the analysis of this single source. So apologies for that. Go and complain to AQA for their failure to do that. As a side note, a lot of the past paper questions, source questions and extract questions, actually have removed their content owing to the fact of various copyright reasons, despite the fact that a lot of the extract questions particularly take passages that are cited and that would be cited in any other historical book, and I have in my academic writings cited quotes, block quotes as big as those, and obviously not had any kind of copyright issues. And also, given the fact that an historian probably isn't going to try and sue AQA for copyright infringement for taking passages out of their books to help students in the future to teach, it seems very silly to me that they have removed a lot of these sources for copyright reasons. But again, I don't work for AQA, so I have no idea, but that's just my 2 cents on the issue. They essentially are rendered meaningless and have no value to future students who want to do past paper questions if you can't actually read the sources that the questions are actually based around. But that's just me. This is the source, though. This is the source that is cited, and it is a source which is a confidential government report on the Paris summit by the US Bureau of Intelligence and Research from the 25th of July, 1960. It says as follows. It says that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin, for those who aren't studying the Cold War period, probably never considered the summit conference as an opportunity to strengthen détente. Détente just simply means an alliance, a relationship. He envisaged it as an opportunity for advancing Soviet foreign policy interests. The conference would probably have continued had the U-2 incident not occurred. Although the USA being forced to acknowledge the flights at the conference, Moscow would gain an important psychological advantage. However, Khrushchev is likely to have calculated that if the conference collapsed, relatively little would be lost, but the USSR could have chosen to play down the incident until the summit was underway. But faced with the prospect of no tangible gains at the summit, Khrushchev welcomed the U-2 incident and collapse of the summit as a means of scoring personal success. So we're talking about a particular summit, the Paris summit, which actually failed. It was scheduled for, I believe, around May 1960. The U-2 incident, for those of you who aren't studying the Cold War period, was basically an incident whereby a U-2 spy plane was shot down. It was very, very embarrassing for everybody, given the fact that essentially it was the US trying to spy on the Soviet Union. And so acknowledging the U-2's existence in the first place would have been embarrassing for the USA, and Khrushchev knew this. The leader of the Soviet Union knew this. Now, the mark scheme says this. It says that students must deploy knowledge of the historical context to show an understanding of the relationship between the sources and the issues raised in the question when assessing the significance of the provenance, the arguments deployed in the sources, and the tone and emphasis of the sources. Descriptive answers which fail to do this shall be awarded no more than a level 2 at best. Answers should address both the value and limitations of the sources for the particular question or the purpose given. Now, the generic mark scheme for level 5 says, and I quote, answers will display a very good understanding of the value of the sources in relation to the issues identified in the question. They will evaluate the sources thoroughly in order to provide a well-substantiated conclusion. The response demonstrates good understanding of historical context. So quite a generic mark scheme, but obviously that's the purpose, okay? Now, before we start looking at how to unpack this source and all these different things, I want to just make a little note on comparison. So students in the previous video that I did many, many years ago, looking at this how to answer source questions, were very, very convinced that for some reason you do not compare sources. They were very, very clear on this. Now, what seems to be the case is that the mark scheme says and makes mention of the following. They say, quote, in responding to the question, students may choose to address each of the source in turn or to adopt a more comparative approach in order to arrive at a judgment. Either approach is equally valid. So what I meant by comparison in the previous video that I made many years ago is to essentially take a look at each of these sources and come to a conclusion as to which of them is more valuable than the others. This requires an element of comparative approach. Now, the way in which you structure your essays will depend. It can be either taking a big chunk of writing and talking about source 1, then source 2, then source 3, or it can be talking about each of these sources comparatively, talking at one or the other, talking about the values of one versus the values of other. Either approach is equally valid. Okay, you are not going to lose marks or fail your answers if you compare sources. Okay, if you actually come to some kind of conclusion as to which source is more valuable by comparing them. Anyone that fails an answer will fail on other grounds. They will fail on other points rather than just comparison. You can't write a level 5 answer and then it go down to a level 1 answer just because you make comparisons between the sources. Ultimately, you are asked and you are invited to find out, to determine which of the sources is more valuable. You're having to come to a conclusion about the value of the sources with reference to other sources. This requires a certain element of comparison. Anyway, let's get on to the points. So let's begin with the surrounding element of the source question, the provenance, the tone, and the emphasis of the sources. So let's think about this with reference to specifically the source in question. What kind of source is it? What kind of thing is it? What is actually the source in question? It's an internal, confidential report prepared by the US Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Why is this either valuable or not valuable for a historian studying the collapse of the Paris Summit, the failure of the Paris Summit? Well, firstly, it shows the US point of view on the Paris Summit, okay? It is not necessarily aiming to persuade a broader audience. It is looking to be a bit more descriptive. It's an internal document. It is a confidential document. This implies that its descriptive nature is at least attempting to be more objective. In terms of its tone, it is very critical of the Soviet Union, as you can tell. This can have value on or not value, and it probably has something of a mixture of value on the one hand, but limitations on the other. So for reasons why it's valuable is it can provide a useful insight into US-Soviet relations at the time, which would then also be useful to a historian who is studying the Paris Summit, a very important part of US-Soviet history. In explaining the failure of the Paris Summit, you might also have to explain essentially or have an insight into what US-Soviet relations were like at the time. The tone, being very critical of the Soviet Union, shows that there is clearly an element of tension between the USA and the Soviet Union, at least in the eyes of the USA, which can obviously be insightful into our understanding of US-Soviet relations at the time, which can therefore be useful and insightful in understanding the Paris Peace Summit. Other points, it is a source which attempts to ascertain the intentions of the Soviet Union from the US perspective. So what it is doing here, look, it is, if we go all the way back, it is talking about what Khrushchev likely would have calculated. He says that, however, Khrushchev is likely to have calculated that the conference would have collapsed. There would have been no. Khrushchev welcomed the U2 incidents and the collapse of the summit as a means of scoring personal success. They're essentially trying to ascertain the intentions of the Soviet Union from a US perspective, okay? This might indicate less value, owing to the fact that it is probably not the USA that is in the best place to conclude Soviet intentions. If I wanted to understand the Soviets' intentions about something, I would probably go to look at Soviet sources, because that will probably give me a better insight into Soviet intentions, okay? But, however, at the same time, if you want to think about this in relation to the historical context, you might come to the conclusion that even though it is trying to ascertain Soviet intentions from a US perspective, it is actually correct in doing so. It has actually come to the correct conclusion. So it may suggest that there is a certain amount of value there, given the fact that it knows of, or at least it has useful insight into the intentions of the Soviet Union. You can then link this as another point that I would make, is that owing to the tone of the source, very critical of the Soviet Union, and if you also have knowledge of the historical context, knowing that in the 1960s, the early 1960s, there was quite a lot of tension in the Cold War, quite highly intense period of time, you could note that in conjunction with the historical context and in conjunction with the fact that it is very critical of the Soviet Union, it may lack an element of charitability. So it may not be particularly charitable in what the other side is saying, essentially, what the Soviet Union believed, what the Soviet Union's intentions were, which of course would suggest that it is of less value. Because if you're not going to be charitable to one side, then you are not really seeking to aim to get some kind of historical truth on a particular matter. So those are the kinds of things that you could think about in relation to the provenance, the tone, the emphasis. This is a non-exhaustive list, as I should mention that there are other things that you could mention, you could talk about. You could also talk about the content and argument. So let's think about the content and argument. A number of arguments are made in this source. Khrushchev, for example, used the U2 incidents to gain an advantage over the USA at the Paris Summit. Is this valuable? I.e., can we support this argument with our knowledge of historical context, with our knowledge of the history? Can I support this argument with the knowledge of the history? Well, on the one hand, you could say yes, because he wanted the agreement to be beneficial to him in relation to the issue of Berlin. At the time, in 1958, there was an ultimatum on the question of Berlin, the future of occupied Germany, and the impact that this would have on Soviet security interests. Gaining an advantage would indicate that the summit was therefore doomed to fail, given the fact that it was not, in the eyes of Khrushchev, a summit for the purposes of coming to some kind of peace arrangement or to try and strengthen détente. It was a summit that was intended to essentially allow him to gain an advantage over the US and use the U2 incident to gain said advantage, to use the embarrassment of the US spying on the Soviet Union to gain an advantage, to have a psychological advantage over them. Another argument that you could make is the fact that the U2 incident was the reason for the failure of the summit. Okay, this is interesting. Okay, if I'm a historian, I'm trying to look and think about how we can explain the failure of the Paris Peace Summit, and I've been given this argument. Well, it was the U2 incident that was the reason for the failure. Well, as a historian, I will think in my brain with all the knowledge that I have, that I've studied over the years and I've read through the textbook, is this valuable? Is this supported with your knowledge of historical context? Well, let's think about it. Firstly, it simply blames the USSR for the failure of the peace summit, and therefore it fails to take into account other reasons which were that were imperative for the failure of the peace summit. not all of which were entirely the fault of the USSR. There were already tensions going on, the ultimatum over Berlin in 1958, the fact that the Cold War was really coming up to its peak in the 1960s. You have things like the Cuban Missile Crisis that will eventually take place. You have things relating to the failure at Camp David and various elements relating to it there. So all of these kinds of things indicate that to blame the failure of the summit entirely on the U2 incident, and therefore entirely on the USSR, is probably not as valuable, because it lacks other elements of historical context. So these are just two arguments that you can make. You can make more arguments here. And essentially what the point is that you analyze the provenance, tone, and emphasis of the source. You analyze the content and the arguments of the source, and you come to a conclusion as to how valuable it is. And then once you've come to a conclusion about how valuable it is, you do it for the next source. And then you do that for the next source. And then if you have time, which you should have time, you should come to a conclusion about which of the three sources is most valuable. Okay? You come to a conclusion, or two sources if you're doing AS, you come to a conclusion at the end and say, at the end of the day, or overall, or finally, or in conclusion, this source is more valuable because. And if your argument is well substantiated, then you will get into that level 5 response. Okay? So, arriving at a judgment, you have to conclude which of the sources is more valuable. You will either have 2 or 3 to analyze, depending on which level you are doing, if you're doing A level or AS level. Now, you can make something of what I would call a fence-sitting argument. These are my favorite arguments to make in any essay, okay? Because fundamentally, history is complicated. History is really complicated. There are lots of different motivations and reasons and causes and structures and events that cause other events and that motivate other people to do lots of different things. It is very rare that there is a single thing that causes a thing to happen, okay? It is also very, very rare that a single source is of perfect value to a historian studying a particular topic. So you will find strengths and weaknesses in every single source. You will arrive at a conclusion that suggests that there are limitations for every single source, and you should do. You should not just conclude that one source is perfect and the other sources are rubbish. You have to conclude that all of the sources have value in certain elements, but all of the sources also have limitations. And given those facts, given the facts that none of them are perfect, they all have limitations, okay, but they all have value, which of them have the most value, okay, and why? Why do they have that most value? And so you can come to a conclusion like, for example, while source A has value in terms of its content, the collective provenance, arguments, and tone of source B aligns more with an accurate understanding of the historical context, and thus is more valuable to a historian. This is something of a fence-sitting argument. It is coming down on one side. It is saying that source B is more valuable, but also suggesting that source A has value as well, but that just source B has a little bit more value. These are all the things that are really important for determining which source has the most value. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've gained some kind of insight into source questions. In terms of a top tip, the top tips are always the same for the extract questions as they are for the source questions. Read the source question carefully. Read every single source carefully. Read the source again carefully. Highlight, pick out the arguments, pick out the provenance, the tone, the emphasis, pick out the things that may be of value and maybe limit the value, and then once you have then planned that essay, you come and you write the essay. In terms of full revision, the best thing you can do, the only thing that you can do that is the most important in my opinion, is source questions practice. You do source question practice, you do extract question practice, you do essay question practice. You practice, you practice, you practice, you practice. It's no good just knowing the things that the textbook says. This is what a lot of students get wrong. When they come to revise, they will just sit down and read the textbook or make 10,000 flashcards that really get you to all the knowledge in your brain. You come to a conclusion that essentially you know everything about the topic, but are you able to apply that information? That is what's most important. If you are able to then apply that information in an essay question, explain why that information is valuable or less valuable, that is really where you're going to get better, useful insight into these kinds of questions.